yes, this is very expensive, but it's more expensive for countries like ours if Ukraine loses the war, because then the defense expenditure you have to have in the future, the cost of building up NATO's borders against Russia will be much greater than the cost of helping Ukraine now. So I think we need to focus minds on that, because this is the biggest issue. The issues going on in the world, but in my view, this is the biggest one in foreign policy.
Let's speak to William Hague and Joan Bakewell now. Morning to you, William.
Good morning.
And morning to you, Joan.
Good morning to you.
So William Hague, the government always tell us that they want to build more houses, and yet they don't seem to get built, or they don't seem to get built on the scale that is needed. Is that the council's fault, or is it actually our fault for not wanting new houses near us? What's the hold up, in your opinion?
Well, it's a whole mixture, isn't it? You just listed in your question a lot of the factors. A lot of people don't want house building in their area, particularly on the green belt, for instance, near their homes. Sometimes councils take too long over planning permission, which is one of the things these proposals seem to be directed at. On top of that, at a time of high interest rates, of course, there can be less home building anyway, because they won't sell so many homes because of mortgage difficulties. And on top of that, we wouldn't necessarily have all the skills in this country, enough bricklayers and electricians and so on, to actually build 300,000 homes every year without quite a lot more immigration. So add all that together, it's really hard for any of the political parties to get to 300,000 a year. Although this government will hit that 1 million a year that we just heard the housing minister, 1 million in the parliament that we just.
That would be impressive.
I know that would be extraordinary. That would be, they'd have to all be prefab, I think. Sorry about that. But 1 million over the life of the Parliament. But I think these proposals are, well, there's some good ideas in there, that councils have to make decisions on time, but that they don't have to have house building that isn't part of the character of their area, that the green belt gets preserved. It's going to be quite a battle at the coming election on housing policy, because the two parties do have different approaches from each other.
But William, does this actually solve anything? Because it just feels like it's stating the obvious, right? You need to build houses, and you need to build them. You need to have a plan within a 3-month period. And if you don't, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. But there will be exemptions for greenbelt land, but not in Cambridge, where we are going to build on greenbelt land. It doesn't feel like there's any huge movement forward.
Can I just say how difficult this is? I sat on the committee for the built environment to look at this problem, and it's very, very complex. You've got to have the infrastructure, you've got to have the roads, the schools, the surgeries. You've got to have all sorts of systems existing before you plonk down houses. Added to that, you've got to take into consideration what local people feel. And they very often don't want housing developments next to them. So it's a long procedure. It isn't a quick fix.
But Joan, it hasn't been quick. That's the point. I feel that we've been having these conversations at least for the last 13 years and possibly before. And with net immigration running at 745,000 a year, we really need more houses. And maybe some of these people need to just stand back.
Yes, but how do you get them to do that? You give people power, and then you tell them they can't exercise it. It's tricky. On the other hand, I think there could be greater density of housing. I think we could have houses in which there are blocks of flats and closer buildings, so that the landscape isn't ruined.
William, what do you think? Because, you hinted at it there, that this is an electoral issue, isn't it? There are some people in certain areas who will just say, well, hang on a sec, if you're going to dictate in some way that houses are going to be built here and perhaps with no accompanying infrastructure, I'm not going to vote for you.
Well, that's a huge problem for the political parties, for the government. Remember, the Conservatives had quite an ambitious policy towards building around London, and then the Chesham and Amersham by-election took place, remember, a couple of years ago, where the Liberals won a landslide victory opposing housing development. So the Conservatives can't then be expected to just write a suicide note for themselves in all the constituencies around the edge of London. and where the green belt is very important. And Labour will find at the coming election that they suffer in those areas because of their house building policy. Now, there's Cambridge that you mentioned earlier, where here the government is saying there can be 150,000 new homes. That's very controversial in Cambridge. That may be the right thing, but it's very controversial, and MPs around Cambridge will say, well, there isn't enough water. Joan's point about infrastructure. So that will turn into a long argument. I think the truth is here, there is not actually a magic answer to this. You have to get 10 or 12 different things right at the same time. The announcement today seems like, well, a reasonable stab in the right direction of doing
10 or
that.
12 things right at the same time sounds like a Christmas dinner.
Let's move on to the perhaps more intractable issue of Baroness Mone and the fallout of that interview her and her husband gave on Sunday. You'll remember that Rishi Sunak, on a visit to a military base, then said he was taking all of this very seriously, which prompted Baroness Mone to say she was completely straight with her involvement with PPE MedPro with government ministers. Lord Bethell, Jim Bethell, who was a health minister at the time, then tweeted to say she wasn't honest about her financial interests to me. She didn't explain from the very beginning about her financial involvement, and even posted an image of a message she sent him. It looks like sort of direct message on Twitter, where she refers to PPE MedPro as they. Obviously, there's an ongoing investigation to all of this, and so much of the facts aren't clear. But should she still be a peer in the House of Lords? She's on a leave of absence at the moment, but Joan, how do you feel about it as a fellow member of the House of Lords? Should she be booted out?
I think she should continue to take leave of absence, because she would come under such scrutiny. And also, it isn't appropriate. I mean, if she's been investigated and they're looking into it, it may not be a legal matter, but it's certainly a financial one, then she should stand back while that goes forward. I don't think she was an enormously participatory member of the House of Lords. It's quite difficult to be effective in the House of Lords. A great many of us, and not all of us, get the chance to have our say. So perhaps she won't be missed. Perhaps she won't miss it.
William, should she make her leave of absence permanent?
I totally agree with Joe. We're on it. We're a good cross-party team this morning. We're agreeing on everything so far. Yes, standing back while investigations take place is a good idea. There's a National Crime Agency investigation. There's a House of Lords Standards investigation, which I think has been paused while that NCA investigation takes place. So it's only fair to say, well, we should all see the outcome of those things. But it would be a sensible thing to stay out of the way in the meantime. Doesn't look good, I have to say, and it would also be a good idea to, in such a deep hole, to stop digging, because that's really, over the last 48 hours, I think she's just dug herself into a deeper hole.
Well, of course, the root issue of this is the issues that we had with PPE during the pandemic. Joan, do you think there's any greater clarity on what actually happened and how it was done that would give you any confidence that in the next pandemic, he said worryingly, this wouldn't happen again?
I don't think we have enough information yet. I think the what they have found so far is contributory, but it isn't conclusive. We need more information. We need more detail. We need more time to absorb it too, because if we're going to change the way we organize our life, our structure, our culture, our behaviors, we need to absorb it properly in a deeply personal way, so that we can deal with the next pandemic, which will arrive, as it surely will.
William, in your column, I mean, there's many bits that struck me, but you say that any hopes for a peace agreement are likely to prove illusory until Russia runs out of men or Ukraine runs out of credit. Who is supplying that credit currently?
Well, that credit is supplied by the UK, by the EU countries, by the United States. Obviously, they've given a lot of financial and military help to Ukraine. But that is what is now in question after the EU failed to come to a decision last week, and the US Congress failed to come to a decision last week. And without such assistance, Ukraine would not be able to carry on. They would for a time. They're a country of very brave, resilient people. But without that aid, they would run out of road. So that's very important. And for other, I point out in my column, yes, this is very expensive, but it's more expensive for countries like ours if Ukraine loses the war, because then the defense expenditure you have to have in the future, the cost of building up NATO's borders against Russia will be much greater than the cost of helping Ukraine now. So I think we need to focus minds on that, because this is the biggest issue. The issues going on in the world, but in my view, this is the biggest one in foreign policy today.
Yes, Joan, this was always the situation. I mean, I remember when the war started in Ukraine, it was always a question of, well, how much do we get involved? How much do we give? How much do we invest in this? And what is the alternative? And that hasn't changed, but how costly might it be if this goes on for another 5 or 10 years? And is that, can people who are suffering, governments who are suffering in terms of the cost of living or whatever their citizens are suffering, can they justify that kind of money over that kind of period of time?
I think Ukraine is central to the politics of the next 10 years. Ukraine is a vast country, and Putin is a hugely ambitious man. So I think we have to regard the Ukraine and its destiny as central to how we think about our strategy and our policy, including our finance. So I do think we need to support it, and we need to have a strategy in alliance with a great many other people as to how to deal with both Putin and the threat to Ukraine.
Let's move on to another topic which is in the news this morning, the question of assisted dying. The complicated legal and moral questions can sometimes seem a bit academic, which I guess is why we all sit up and listen when we hear some people that we admire talk about it. Remember, it wasn't too long ago that the late Diana Rigg's views on the subject became clear in The Observer. She described the pain and indignity of dying. Now we have Esther Rantzen telling the BBC that she's weighing up using Dignitas to avoid a similar fate, and saying that perhaps the law should catch up. Of course, it's illegal assisted dying in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. There's no specific assisted suicide offence in Scotland. Joan, what did you make of what Esther Rantzen had to say?
Well, I think that's her right. It's very like her to be so upfront and clear about what she intends. I think all of us who are old are beginning to think how we will die and what concerns we want made about it. I have written a document addressed to my children saying that I don't want to be resuscitated. I don't want effort to be made to keep me alive if the prospect of my life is unpleasant and unattractive, and I'm leaving it to them. I've not mentioned the law. That's up to them to decide how they behave. I know people who have decided they want to die and stop eating. That's perfectly possible to take control of your life by ending it in that way. So I think all sorts of possibilities need to be considered, particularly by those who are dying. It's our lives, and we have rights right to the very end to make choices. And I think we should enter into discussions about that with our children, our medical advisors, or for anyone who we want to share with. And I think that's a big opportunity, and it's bold of Esther, typical of her, to open it up publicly.
But you say it's about choices, but I guess her point is that assisted dying isn't a choice, and that if she were to do it, she'd have to go to Zurich by herself if she didn't want her friends or family to be at risk of prosecution, and that needs to change. I mean, do you have sympathy with that view?
I have sympathy with the view that we should have control over our own choices in dying. I mean, I've known people who simply stop eating. They don't have to go to Zurich. And I've known people who say to their family, can you just make sure that I don't get medical treatment that's going to keep me going? So there are ways of, if you discuss it, if you talk about it, if you bring it out of the shadows and talk about it, then you do take control of it to some extent. You can't stop dying. We're all going to die. So it's quite an appropriate thing that everybody should consider how they would like to die or how they would prefer to die. Nobody wants to go.
Yes. William, this is such a thorny issue. Why do you think that Parliament hasn't actually taken this on head on and had a debate and actually tried to reason some kind of answer rather than just I don't know, it's sort of left out there, isn't it?
Because there are lots of different people trying to influence how we decide things like that. It's a very intimate matter, but it's also a highly moral issue. So you have churches of different persuasions, religions of different persuasions, outlooks, atheistic views, humanist views, all taking an attitude towards it, which is hard to legislate for. The only legislation is make up your own mind and find your way through this minefield without breaking the law.
William?
Yeah, Joan's answered my question for me very well. There are, of course, arguments the other way. I think I've moved in the Esther Rantzen direction because I used to vote against new legislation on this years and years ago in the House of Commons. The argument has moved on, but it's still very difficult. And we discussed on the radio last week, on this program, the excellent article by Hugo Rifkind a week ago, which pointed out all the difficulties of how you change the relationship between people who are dying and the rest of us if you change the law. A kind of expectation about assisted dying in some cases. So these are the reasons Parliament hasn't really brought matters to a head. But I would predict it will do in the next 5 years or so. I think the law will move on to give greater allowance for assisted dying.
Do you think that will change the relationship, Joan, if we make it easier for people to take their own life with assistance if they feel like that's what they need because of their current circumstances? If that's legislated for, do you think that will put a pressure on people?
No, I don't think so. I think your own life is your most precious possession. Departing from it is an absolutely intimate affair for you and your destiny. So law is a trivial matter by comparison to what goes on in your inner heart. And you will deal that in your own term. Now, what is legal or not legal is almost peripheral to the deep decisions you come to about the way you leave this world. And I think that matters much more than whether you run into trouble with the law and the police knock on the door and say stop taking the tablets. I've no idea about that, and I think that's kind of the trivial story about it. Spoils the fact that this is one of the most important things that happens to you, to end your life, and it's also going to happen to every single one of us. So it does behove us to think about it, to talk about it, to consider, read about it, but not to rush to judgment about it.
We're going to end by talking about Gen Z, who are apparently on TikTok. The Times' Robert Crampton has been weighing up the advice he should be dispensing to Gen Z after learning that there were a lot more people his age using TikTok than he thought, sharing their life experience to others. So this is what he settled on, his dad type advice. Don't get a motorbike when you hit 17. Don't get piercings or a face tattoo. I think after a quite frightening conversation about ketamine's effect on the body earlier, we'll probably put that on the don't do list either. So both of you, do you have any advice that I'm sure you wouldn't, well, I don't know if you're on TikTok, I doubt it, but I could be wrong. If you were on TikTok, what advice, life advice, would you be giving to the younger generation? William?
Well, first of all, don't get hooked on social media. Don't spend all your time on TikTok for the first thing. But then I think it would be good to pass on a little bit of accumulated wisdom about reading books, which not everybody in Generation Z or Generation Z does these days, about the joys of reading, about how much more you learn than actually browsing things on the internet or even listening to podcasts. Even that there's something different about books, and I think a crash course on TikTok about that might benefit people.
So I'm not on TikTok, William, and neither are you, but apparently there is such a thing called book talk, which is basically people recommending books, and then everyone goes and reads them. So there is encouragement to read on TikTok. It's called book talk.
That is excellent news, and that's clearly the bit of TikTok that I should be signed up to and taking part in that I'd never even heard of. But that's extremely good.
Well, anyway, the advice still is still very much worth it. Joan, if you were to dispense some life advice to Gen Z on TikTok, what would it be?
I think it would be to listen to your own heart and your own inner self more, rather than take the cheap advice of passing strangers who perhaps don't know about you or what your interests are. To listen to your heart. It sounds a rather corny idea, but I mean, the nourishment for that comes from things like books, which I agree with William are worth reading, books, serious music, listening. I read poetry. I think thoughtfulness is important. The ideas of wise people are worth paying attention to without getting too hooked on philosophy. But I mean, I think a thoughtfulness towards the end of your life as you live it is very important.
And have you listened to your heart throughout your life, Joan, would you say?
I try to make time, not be rushed by the hurly-burly of all sorts of things that engage you, which you want to take part in. Find time. I think looking at a tree in blossom is one of the most reassuring things in life.
Yes. I can totally understand that. Joan, thank you very much for that little kind of calm, peaceful point to end the panel on.